Welcome to the Woman Worriers podcast, where we're working to help you call a truce with your anxiety. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Now, here's your host, Elizabeth Cush, LCPC.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Woman Worriers podcast. Today, we're going to do something a little different. I have as a guest today, Dr. Ellis Edmunds. He's a psychologist out in Oakland, California, and his practice is focused on men with anxiety. So we're going to do a little exploring into how he helps men manage their anxiety, and we're going to explore how mindfulness can enrich and grow your relationships. I hope you enjoy the interview. Hi, Ellis. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah. Pleasure to be here.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you into the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So, right now I'm a psychologist with a private practice in Oakland. And really what got me into the work, I would say, was my own anxiety, sort of my own story from really going back to high school. I could sort of pinpoint having a lot of social anxiety around meeting new people, talking to love interests, or especially like giving a presentation in front of the class. I would just get terribly nervous, start jittering, sweating, and just have a really hard time, a lot of anxiety in those kind of situations for myself.
Yeah.
And not really being that self-aware in high school. And it wasn't until sort of college when I got more interested in psychology and then, of course, mindfulness practices that I really became more aware of my own internal process, what was happening with me, my own anxiety and how it was showing up for me. And so that kind of got me down this whole path and really interested in anxiety itself.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, it can really, well, especially with social anxiety, but anxiety can impact, relationships, reaching out to people, just how we present ourselves in the world. And, I share openly as well that that's what has brought me to this work as well, that, my own anxiety and my journey on learning how to manage it has really helped me sort of hone what I want my practice to be.
Mm-hmm. Great. We're in it together then.
Yes, we are. We are. So I was kind of perusing your website before the interview, and I just love this concept that you've developed of magic. The word magic is so magical and positive, but I would love for you to kind of tell us more about that and what it stands for.
Oh, sure. So magic is sort of this acronym that I recently created, and it sort of stands for 5 different practices that I kind of have found have been useful for myself and my own development, and especially useful for clients and their own growth, and can really help with anxiety especially. So it sort of stands for 5 different practices. The M is for mindfulness practices, which we can definitely talk more about.
Yep.
And the A stands for taking action in the world that aligns with your values. The G stands for gratitude practices. The I is for insight practices, and then the C is compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm happy to talk more specifically about each of those if you'd like. That's kind of the overview of magic.
Yeah. So tell me, mindfulness, we're going to kind of get to that in a little bit, but talk to me a little bit more about like the action and insight. How do you see those? And gratitude, all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I could talk for hours about it all, but I'll give a brief overview of those. So action really means to sort of when you go out in the world, we have a lot of choices of how we want to act and how we want to respond to other people and what happens. And so acting on our values is sort of a two-step process of kind of knowing what's important to us, what matters to us, the kind of person that we want to be in the world, and then acting in accordance with that, and knowing what that would look like. For example, even in a relationship, if sort of empathy is important to you, an action could just be even listening to your partner and trying to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that could be an acting on your values. So that's sort of action. Gratitude is the idea that we can kind of shift our perspective on things, on kind of anything that's going on in our life, essentially. And oftentimes it's thought of looking sort of at the positive, looking at what's going well in our life, what we can be thankful for that we have. And that's great and a good practice. Sometimes keeping a gratitude journal or having a partner that you can just reflect the things that are going well for you in your life and shift our mindset. We often kind of focus on the negative, what's going wrong, and I think anxiety plays a big role in that.
Oh my gosh, so much.
Focusing on the negative, and so gratitude can kind of shift our perspective to the positive and what's going well. And then insight sort of means to look within, to take your sight and place it within yourself, and to know ourselves well, and to kind of understand our process. And sort of, I mentioned that this was sort of important to me, finding mindfulness practices and kind of understanding myself better. And I think through therapy, that can be a really good way, or journaling practices can be helpful for kind of understanding ourselves and cultivating more insight. So when, we get triggered or things come up in life, we kind of know what to do.
Absolutely.
And then compassion is sort of about loving ourselves in the difficult times, and loving others when they're suffering as well. I think of it as like when suffering meets love, then we can kind of create compassion. Nice. So it's this sort of intention of wanting to relieve the suffering in ourselves or others. And sometimes it's a lot easier to kind of help others when they're suffering and harder for ourselves. So
much. Yeah.
Yeah. I tend to help people more with the self-compassion practices, which can be so helpful for anxiety.
Oh my gosh, I agree 100%. But hard for those who have a lot of anxiety and really have never practiced self-compassion before. That can be a struggle.
Yeah, this is why it's a practice. It's something that you kind of need to cultivate over time, and just like any skill, it's going to be really weird and awkward at first, for sure.
So, as I said to you before we got started, you're like my alter ego across the West. You're on the West Coast and you're working with people who have anxiety, but you're working with men. So I would really like to kind of talk about that and how you see anxiety impacting men and how you help them.
Yeah. So I think anxiety can kind of show up in a lot of different ways with men. I can see it in a lot of different flavors, but probably the most common, or one of the most common ways, is like one in relationships. For sure, it can show up in either sort of the more like worrying about the relationship, if they're in a relationship, worrying about the closeness or the stability of the relationship. Or it can also kind of show up in the opposite of having a fear of too much closeness, too much intimacy in a relationship, and kind of wanting to pull away from it. And then I think oftentimes anxiety shows up and affects people's sleep. I think that's the ultimate test of how anxious you are. Is when all your activities are done for the day and you lie down at night, what goes on with your body, what goes on with your mind. with anxiety, typically there's like a worry about maybe what happened during the day, what this person said, what did that mean, or how did things go at work? Like, am I going to get fired? It could be any sorts of stuff.
Absolutely.
And then our mind can also kind of project into the future and say, like, what's going to happen tomorrow? Like this presentation I have, how is it going to go? And, all sorts of anxiety can show up when we try to go to sleep. And so I think that, if you're not sleeping well, there's typically some sort of anxiety that's showing up that's preventing it sometimes.
Absolutely. Okay, I just want to ask, do you think, are there particular things, so you said within relationships, for men, closeness can be an issue. Are there other anxieties or ways that anxiety presents itself that are more particular to men than women? Do you see that?
I'm not sure if there's necessarily a particular gender difference. I think maybe there is some more socialization for men to sort of not care as much about their relationships as women. So perhaps there is more of a slant toward the I'm thinking about attachment styles and the more avoidant attachment.
And what about like sort of the underlying causes of the anxiety? Like I know, our culture is, men hear the story of like, don't feel too much, don't share too much, be a man. And do you feel like that contributes to the sort of anxiety package for them?
Yes. So how they respond to the anxiety. Yeah, I do think that does play a role in terms of being able to show it or being aware of it or, just being able to show kind of like quote unquote weakness in some ways. I think men often get socialized to, develop their mind a lot with logical reasoning or to kind of be really good at sports is another thing that men get encouraged to do, but oftentimes they're not encouraged to really look at their emotional landscape. And so they tend to sort of push away their emotions, and oftentimes that's how they're relating to their anxiety, is to just not go there, essentially.
Yeah. Or even if you... I'm imagining that, and plus I have some male clients too. So if you were an emotional man, someone who was raised to be in touch with the emotions, and that might be a difficult place in the world for you too, if every other guy was like all manly and, or whatever, the stereotypical don't feel, don't share.
Yeah, it can certainly make you feel different and like, you're too feminine or something to that regard. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so how, what's the process for you to help men who are struggling with anxiety?
Yeah. So it's a lot of sort of the magic that I talked about. And we didn't really talk about mindfulness.
No. So let's talk about that.
But I think that's one of the main things that I help people with. And to me, mindfulness means a few things. Really kind of like being in the present moment is maybe the most important piece of mindfulness, to kind of be here now with what is. And so that's sort of like the opposite of denial. Or, the anxious mind typically wants to project into the future about all the terrible things that are going to happen in the future, or even go into the past and worry about what happened in the past and how that's going to affect your future. And so being in the present moment, and often those practices are kind of being more in your body, or being more in your emotions, can really be helpful for people to kind of look at their anxiety. Well, and especially
if you've learned to sort of tune out the emotion and how it impacts your body and your brain, that tuning in, the more mindful way of being, I would imagine, can be super well. I know, because I practice it too. It can be very helpful.
Yeah. And there's this other idea in mindfulness, which is acceptance. which I think is also important. And you can also think of acceptance as sort of like openness, or more like a willingness to be able to feel what's there. Oftentimes you could think the opposite is sort of like struggle, which is like our anxiety shows up, and then we start to get into a big internal fight with it. Like we don't like the anxiety, we try to push it away, or we try to run away from our anxiety, or we start to argue with our anxiety. Or we, very common is we kind of criticize ourselves for having anxiety, or something wrong with me. And so self-criticism can show up with anxiety all the time. So acceptance is sort of being able to kind of drop all of that and just kind of be with what is, and to kind of be open to it, and willingness to feel your feelings. So, yeah.
Well, and I think for a lot of people who have anxiety, who haven't actively worked on it, or maybe this is how they've, sort of coped with it, is that denial or pushing away or busyness to keep it at bay until you lie down to fall asleep at night, and there it is. But that it feels uncomfortable to really allow it and accept it. And that can be a challenge.
Yeah, it can certainly feel uncomfortable, especially at first. I often say sometimes it feels like it's getting worse before it gets better. Because when you become more aware of your anxiety and it sort of comes more to the surface, you actually start to feel it more. And it can also often feel worse. But with time, if you continue to practice acceptance and openness, then it tends to ease out. But yeah, it can be hard at first, for sure.
Yeah. So as you said, it's a practice. The whole mindfulness part of it is a practice. And well, and I think too, the compassion piece enters into that little bit as well, as like, when it is hard, to know that you're not the only person struggling, too, that yes, this is hard, but this is
you're not alone, for sure, in your struggles. And compassion, I think, is also about kind of creating safety within ourselves, to kind of create a safe space that we can be with our feelings and still, feel safe and loved, and be okay that we're feeling the way that we are.
Absolutely. Well, so before we, I do want to talk about mindfulness and how that can be helpful within relationships. But I just wanted to read a quick little talking about space and how mindfulness has helped you. You say on your website, yoga and mindfulness provide me with a sense of inner peace and lightheartedness. They have helped me create a more peaceful and loving relationship with my mind, body, and emotions. And I thought that was really, I don't know, it's just a very all-encompassing process to me. The whole mindfulness piece is that we are learning to accept and allow all the stuff that comes up with anxiety.
Yeah. It's not about trying to get rid of the anxiety. It's just about being with it in a more peaceful way, I think. Almost befriending it. Right. Which also, I think, for some people is like, what? What do you mean? Yeah. I don't want to be friends with it. Of course, yeah. It's a process. You start off by hating it typically and really don't like it, and then with more exposure, you eventually kind of get to neutral. Oh, I'm okay with it, and then eventually you can kind of be okay and like it. But, yeah.
Well, yeah. And what I have learned in my own journey through therapy and just mindfulness is that actually the anxiety really brings to the surface things that I am struggling with that I have sort of pushed away for a long time. It really brings to the surface how some of these past stories that we incorporate into our being, like I am this kind of a person, or this is, or no one's going to listen to me, or whatever it is, like these stories we've incorporated from our lives. And it kind of is a little like, ding, 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 here I am again. You should be paying attention.
Yeah, it reminds us to pay attention, to care for ourselves.
Yeah.
And the other thing our anxiety does is it actually points us to our values in a lot of ways. If you think about the things that we worry about the most, that we think about the most, those are often the things that we actually care about the most.
Yeah.
And so it can kind of show us what really matters to us in a lot of ways.
Oh, I love that. I love that idea. So how, I know you do some relationship work in your practice. And how do you see mindfulness entering that space, but also how can it help in a relationship?
Yeah, mindfulness, how can it not help? I work with a lot of individuals on their relationship, and I think mindfulness can show up in a lot of ways we've spoken about, but I think, again, just being in the present moment, starting there, and kind of when you're with another person, especially with your partner, being present with them can make so much of a difference in terms of the relationship. If one person is distracted, always on their phone, whatever, but taking some time with your partner to just be in the here and now with them and really kind of attune to what's going on, can really be helpful in terms of building a safe relationship. I think that the acceptance piece is also very important in terms of relationships. Applying acceptance in terms of your own feelings and thoughts, but also especially toward your partner and what they're kind of going through and what their process is like. And sometimes relationships can get in this dynamic of always trying to change the other person and pointing out their flaws, etc. But acceptance you can take a step back and just kind of be with the other one and kind of, accept them for what they are.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is a message that comes up often in sessions with my clients is that, we do often want to change. We feel like our anxiety would be better or, not as intense if the other person would only do whatever it is, when really like the change can ultimately only come from within ourselves. I mean, yes, there things can change, but really it has to be us that, whether it is being more present or more accepting or more compassionate, whatever it might be, or insightful, that it does have to come from us.
Yeah, and sometimes the way that we treat others is sometimes the way that we treat ourselves too. And so if we become more accepting to ourselves, we can become more accepting to our partner, and sometimes that can really just shift the relationship. If we start to be the one that's more present and accepting, it can kind of shift the whole energy of the relationship.
Oh, yeah. Well, and two, accepting and the whole compassion piece too. Like if we can be compassionate towards ourselves, what I've noticed is that I become more aware of when I think other people are judging me. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute, maybe it's me that's judging myself. And can I find that compassion? And then it does create that space in the relationship.
Yeah, and it can also help you, I think, with setting good boundaries in relationships, which is important too. And knowing that, if the other person is not being very loving and that you need to kind of step away and take a break, which is, good self-care, which is so important in relationships as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because yes, if someone isn't treating you the way, you would want someone to treat you or you would treat yourself, that's important to notice too. So if you had a tip or resources that you felt like it would really be important for listeners to know and understand, what might that be? And it could be both a tip and a resource. So,
let's see. Well, I think mindfulness practices are great. That would be my tip is to start there. And there's so many ways to sort of practice mindfulness. The traditional way is more like formal meditation, which I think is great. Me myself, I go to like different meditation groups, and I find meditating with a group to be really helpful. So finding both the practice and like a support system to help you with your mindfulness practice can be really powerful. Today there's, a whole bunch of apps out there that people use for mindfulness, which is great. Audio CDs, YouTube videos. There's a ton of books. I love Thich Nhat Hanh is one of my favorite authors. So I would recommend creating some sort of mindfulness practice for yourself. And yoga, I think, could be a good practice. Could be movement or getting into nature. Anything that kind of gets you into the present moment with like this openness and acceptance piece.
Nice. And I know that you have some resources also on your website. You have a game, or maybe more than one game?
Yeah, I have two games out now.
Tell us about that.
So that is, the first one's called The Mindful Bus, and the other one's called Drop the Rope. And those are two games which are sort of based off of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is the type of therapy I do with clients. And so, you can check that out at themindfulbus.com. I could briefly explain the games if you'd like to.
Sure. Give us an overview of what they are.
So, the mindful bus is based off of this metaphor, which is that your life is like a bus and that you are the bus driver. And the idea is to sort of determine the direction you want the bus to go, and that represents your values, the things that are important to you. Now, also on your bus, you have a bunch of passengers on your bus, and those represent your thoughts, your feelings, past experiences. Your parents are often on your bus as passengers, and those passengers show up and sometimes try to tell you which direction to drive your bus, what to do with your life, how to live your life. And so the idea of the game is to sort of, there's different cards, and they have different mindfulness exercises. So to use mindfulness to kind of let go of these unhelpful passengers and come back to your values and the direction you want your life to go.
Oh, nice. I like that.
Yeah. The other one is called Drop the Rope, which is based on this other metaphor that we kind of, like I mentioned, we get into these big internal struggles with ourselves, with our emotions typically. And it can kind of feel like a tug of war battle sometimes with our anxiety. And Drop the Rope is sort of the idea that we don't have to keep fighting with this anxiety monster if we don't want to. It's very tempting sometimes to keep fighting with it, to try to push it away or prove it wrong or whatever we do. But we can ultimately just learn to let go of this battle that we're having and to kind of do something more in line with our values in our life.
Oh, that's awesome. Very cool. They both sound great. I have not tried them, but I think I heard you talk about the Mindful Bus with Lourdes Viado on her podcast, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any upcoming projects or things that you would like the listeners to know about? And how would they find you if they wanted to?
Yeah. So you can check me out at my website, drellisedmunds.com. And I have a newsletter up there that I send out once a month. It's completely free, and you can sign up for it. And it's all tips about cultivating mindfulness in your life and helping yourself with anxiety using mindfulness. So that's a completely free resource that I have on my website for anyone that wants to sign up for it.
Awesome. And I will say I'll advocate for the newsletter. I get that, and I always get something meaningful out of it. So I appreciate your offering that for free.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure to write. So
nice. Well, Ellis, I really appreciate the time you took with us today. And, I will have all the resources that you mentioned in the show notes. And thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's fun.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Ellis Edmunds. I think what really struck me was that no matter what the cause or where your anxiety, where it stems from, where it grows from, how it came about, that mindfulness can really help you call a truce with your anxiety. It can help you learn how to not only accept, but maybe even learn how to appreciate what your anxiety wants you to know in those moments when you're anxious. As Ellis said, anxiety can really help you tune into your values and what's important to you. So that's really powerful and kind of an exciting way to look at it. So I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you found this podcast interesting and helpful. If you have suggestions for what you would like to hear on the podcast in future episodes, please feel free to reach out through my website, womanworriers.com. Click on the Contact Me button and shoot me an email. Have a wonderful week. Ciao for now from this Woman Worrier.
Thanks for listening and subscribing to the Woman Worriers podcast. Music was written and performed by Andy Cush. If you'd like more information on this episode, you can find the show notes, the resources shared today, and links to the guests' profiles at womanworriers.com.